The adult who can't set boundaries at work, who accommodates every request while resenting everyone involved, is often not making a conscious choice about professional behavior. They're enacting a survival strategy learned at age 6 when saying no to a volatile parent meant emotional withdrawal or punishment. The boundaryless adult and the hypervigilant child are the same person operating from the same defensive structure, just in different contexts separated by decades. The inner child isn't a metaphor for innocence lost or a sentimental concept about reclaiming joy. It's psychological shorthand for the developmental self-states, particularly from early childhood, that formed under specific relational conditions and that continue influencing adult behavior, emotional regulation, attachment patterns, and the capacity to accurately perceive and respond to present reality rather than reacting to past threats that no longer exist. Healing that inner child doesn't mean regressing to childish behavior or indulging wounded feelings. It means recognizing when adult choices are being driven by childhood adaptations that no longer serve, understanding what those adaptations protected against, and gradually building new response patterns that reflect current reality rather than historical necessity. The difficulty is that these childhood patterns operate largely outside conscious awareness until something forces recognition. The person who chronically overworks, who can't stop achieving even when exhaustion demands rest, might genuinely believe they're ambitious or disciplined. The person who sabotages relationships at the point of deepening intimacy might think they just haven't found the right person yet. The person who can't tolerate being alone might explain it as preference for social connection. But underneath the adult rationalization sits a child who learned that worth is conditional on performance, or that vulnerability leads to abandonment, or that being alone means being unsafe. The patterns make sense when traced back to their origins. A child who experienced love as contingent on achievement develops into an adult for whom rest feels dangerous and self-worth depends entirely on output. A child who was abandoned or neglected when expressing need learns to preemptively withdraw before intimacy reaches the threshold where need would become visible. A child who was left alone before they had the developmental capacity to self-regulate retains the nervous system activation that equates solitude with threat. These aren't choices. They're adaptations that served essential protective functions during childhood, but now create the very problems they once prevented. The concept of the inner child comes from multiple therapeutic traditions, but gained particular traction through John Bradshaw's work on shame and recovery in the late 20th century, and more recently through attachment theory research showing how early relational templates remain active throughout life. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and refined by Mary Ainsworth and subsequent researchers, demonstrates that the quality of early caregiving relationships creates internalized working models of self and others that shape all subsequent relationships. A securely attached child, one who experienced consistent, attuned caregiving, develops an internal model where they're worthy of care. Others are trustworthy and responsive, and needs can be expressed safely without threat of abandonment or punishment. An insecurely attached child develops models where they're unworthy of consistent care, others are unreliable or rejecting, and needs must be suppressed or strategically managed to maintain connection. These models aren't conscious beliefs that can be changed through rational argument. They're deeply encoded patterns in the nervous system, visible in how the body responds to relational stress, what emotional states feel tolerable versus threatening, and what behaviors automatically activate when attachment needs emerge. The reason addressing the inner child is clinically useful rather than just psychologically metaphorical lies in how memory and emotion are stored neurobiologically. Traumatic or significantly distressing childhood experiences get encoded differently than neutral memories. The explicit narrative memory, the coherent story of what happened, may be fragmented or absent, particularly for very early experiences before language development allowed verbal encoding. But the implicit emotional and somatic memory remains fully active. The body remembers. The nervous system remains calibrated to the threat environment of childhood, even when the current environment is entirely different. Someone who grew up in chaos may find calm environments intolerable because their physiology is tuned to hyperarousal, interpreting peace as the calm before danger rather than as actual safety. Someone who learned that emotional expression brought punishment may experience profound physical discomfort when trying to identify or articulate their own feelings. These aren't weaknesses or failures of will. They're how developmental trauma shapes the neurobiological structures that govern perception, emotional regulation, and behavior. Inner child work, at its most effective, involves creating new emotional experiences with old memory structures. Not just understanding cognitively what happened, but providing the felt sense of safety, validation, or attunement that was absent developmentally. This process, known as memory reconsolidation, actually changes how the memory is stored neurobiologically, reducing the emotional charge and updating the threat response systems that keep enacting outdated protective patterns. The challenge appears in recognizing which adult reactions are present appropriate and which are inner child activations. Someone responds with intense shame to minor criticism at work. That could be present appropriate if the criticism is genuinely harsh and inappropriate. Or it could be the inner child responding to criticism the way they learned to respond as a child when parental disapproval felt life-threatening. The distinguishing factor is proportion. When emotional reactions are disproportionate to the stimulus, when someone feels devastated by feedback that others would find mildly disappointing, or when a minor conflict triggers complete relational collapse, that disproportion usually indicates inner child activation. The adult isn't responding to what's happening now. The child is responding to. What happened then, using the only response strategies available at that developmental stage? Similarly, when patterns repeat across different contexts and relationships, always ending up in the same dynamic despite conscious intentions otherwise, that consistency points to an internal template rather than external circumstances. If every intimate relationship ends with the person feeling abandoned, despite partners being different people with different behaviors, the common factor isn't the partners. It's the internal model expecting and unconsciously engineering abandonment, often as a way to maintain control over when the inevitable betrayal happens. In relational dynamics, unhealed inner child material doesn't just shape individual behavior, it becomes visible in how others respond. Someone whose inner child learned to be hyper-vigilant to others' needs while suppressing their own will often find themselves surrounded by people who take without reciprocating. This isn't coincidence or bad luck, it's selection and training. The person unconsciously gravitates toward relationships that replicate the familiar caretaking dynamic, and they unconsciously train others through their own behavior, accommodating everything, never expressing need, signaling that boundary violations will be tolerated, how to treat them in ways that reinforce the pattern. Similarly, someone whose inner child learned that vulnerability leads to rejection may present as emotionally distant or self-sufficient in ways that keep potential partners at arm's length, then experience that distance as confirmation that intimacy isn't safe, without recognizing their own role in creating the distance they fear. The feedback loops are self-reinforcing. The inner child's protective strategies create exactly the relational outcomes they're designed to prevent, which then confirms the child's belief about how relationships work, strengthening the pattern further. Working with the inner child effectively requires first establishing enough present moment safety that approaching painful childhood material becomes tolerable. Therapy frameworks like EMDR, somatic experiencing, and internal family systems someone whose nervous system is chronically dysregulated, who lacks basic emotional regulation skills, who is in active crisis, needs stabilization work first. Inner child healing for someone in that state can re-traumatize rather than heal, because the adult self doesn't yet have the capacity to hold and metabolize what emerges. Once basic stability exists, the work involves creating what's called a dual perspective, the capacity to simultaneously be the hurt child experiencing the pain and the compassionate adult holding that experience. One practice for developing this involves writing from the child's perspective about a specific painful memory or pattern, allowing the expression of whatever emotions and needs were suppressed at the time. Then, writing a response from the adult perspective, not minimizing or fixing, but acknowledging, validating, and offering what the child needed then. This isn't about changing the past. It's about changing the internal relationship to past experience, updating the child's conclusion that they were alone or bad or too much, and introducing the felt sense that they're now seen, acceptable, and not alone with the pain anymore. Another dimension involves recognizing and gradually interrupting automatic responses that served the child but harmed the adult. Someone who learned to fawn, to automatically prioritize others' needs and suppress their own, can practice noticing when that pattern activates. The noticing itself is the intervention. When asked to take on more work, instead of automatically saying yes, pause. Notice the automatic impulse to accommodate. Notice what fear arises with the thought of saying no. Fear of rejection, fear of being perceived as difficult, fear of not being needed. Just noticing creates a gap between stimulus and response where conscious choice becomes possible. From that gap, a different response can emerge. Not a forced boundary that feels false, but a choice informed by present reality rather than childhood fear. That choice might still be yes, but it's a conscious yes based on actual preference and capacity rather than an automatic yes driven by unexamined panic about what refusal might cost. Over time, repeated small choices like this rebuild the neural pathways, teaching the nervous system that boundaries don't lead to catastrophe and that authentic expression of need and limit is survivable. A third practice uses imagination to provide the child with experiences they didn't receive. This might sound like empty fantasy, but neurobiology research shows that vividly imagined experiences activate similar neural networks as actual experiences. Someone whose child self was left alone in distress can visualize their adult self entering that childhood scene, not to fix what happened, but to be present with the child in their pain. The adult self might hold the child, speak to them the words they needed to hear, validate their feelings, stay until the child feels less alone. This isn't denial about what happened. It's providing a corrective emotional experience that updates the child's core belief about being alone with unbearable feelings. After the visualization, a symbolic action in present reality reinforces the new experience. Maybe allowing yourself to rest when tired instead of pushing through. Maybe expressing a need to someone safe. Maybe doing something playful or spontaneous that the over-controlled child wasn't permitted. These actions communicate to the nervous system that the old rules don't apply anymore, that the adult self is trustworthy and capable of providing what was missing developmentally. The fourth approach involves directly challenging the core shame or belief structures that developed from childhood wounds. Most inner child patterns are maintained by deeply held beliefs formed before language or logic developed. The child who was neglected concluded they're unimportant or burdensome. The child who was criticized relentlessly concluded they're fundamentally flawed. The child whose emotional expressions were punished concluded their feelings are bad and dangerous. These conclusions made sense given the evidence available to the child, but they're not objectively true. They're survival interpretations. As an adult, examining these beliefs with compassionate skepticism becomes possible. Where's the actual evidence that you're unlovable? Not evidence that someone didn't love you well, that might be abundant, but evidence that you're inherently unlovable as a permanent characteristic? When examined honestly, the belief usually reveals itself as a child's explanation for painful circumstances beyond their control, not as accurate assessment of inherent worth. Recognizing that distinction doesn't instantly dissolve the belief, but it creates space for alternative possibilities to coexist. Maybe I'm not unlovable. Maybe I just experienced inadequate care. Maybe the problem wasn't me. Maybe I deserved better than I received. These reframes aren't about blame, not blaming parents or circumstances, but about releasing the child from responsibility for things that weren't their fault or within their control. The fifth method involves reparenting through consistent daily practices that provide what the child needed but didn't receive. This isn't about indulgence or avoiding adult responsibilities. It's about systematically meeting developmental needs that went unmet. If the child never experienced consistent attunement, the adult can practice attuning to their own internal states, checking in throughout the day with what they're actually feeling and needing rather than pushing through on autopilot. If the child's accomplishments were ignored or minimized, the adult can practice acknowledging their own efforts and successes, even small ones, providing the recognition that was absent. If the child experienced chaos and unpredictability, the adult can create structure and routine that the nervous system finds regulating. If the child was forced into premature independence, the adult can practice asking for help and allowing themselves to receive support. These practices aren't self-indulgent, they're corrective. They teach the system through repeated experience that needs matter, that care is available, and that the world isn't uniformly hostile or neglectful. Over time, this internal reparenting changes the baseline assumptions the nervous system operates from, making secure attachment patterns possible even when they weren't. Established in childhood. The sixth dimension addresses the somatic aspect of inner child wounds. Trauma and neglect aren't just stored as memories or beliefs. They're held in the body as chronic tension, constricted breathing, numbing, or hyperarousal. Someone whose child self learned that crying brought punishment might hold chronic tension in their throat and chest, physically suppressing the impulse to express distress. Someone who froze in the face of threat might still experience dissociation or numbing when stressed. Somatic practices like breathwork, gentle movement, or body-focused therapies like somatic experiencing help release these held patterns. The work involves bringing gentle awareness to areas of tension or numbness, noticing what emotions or memories arise as the body begins to release, and allowing the physical expression, shaking, crying, sounds that was suppressed in childhood. This isn't dramatic catharsis for its own sake. It's completing defensive responses that got interrupted, allowing the nervous system to discharge activation that's been held for years or decades. As the somatic holding releases, emotional and cognitive patterns often shift as well, since they were all part of an integrated defensive response. The seventh practice involves gradually building what secure attachment provides: the internalized sense of being worthy, the expectation that needs can be met, and the capacity to regulate emotions without chronic reliance on others or complete avoidance of connection. This happens through what's called earned secure attachment, developing through adult relationships and therapeutic work what wasn't established in childhood. A consistent therapeutic relationship where the therapist remains attuned, reliable, and non-abandoning, even when the client tests boundaries or expresses difficult material, provides a corrective experience. Friendships where vulnerability is met with acceptance rather than judgment gradually update expectations about what relationships can offer. Romantic partnerships where both people commit to repair after conflict demonstrate that rupture doesn't mean abandonment. These experiences don't erase childhood wounds, but they provide new data that challenges old conclusions. With enough repetition, the nervous system begins to trust that secure connection is possible, that expressing need doesn't lead to rejection, and that conflict can be navigated without catastrophic loss. This is healing not as return to an idealized state that never existed, but as forward development that incorporates childhood wounds while building new capacities that weren't available during the original wounding. Integration happens gradually as these practices accumulate over months and years. The goal isn't eliminating the inner child or transcending childhood patterns entirely. The goal is differentiating them, recognizing when the child is driving behavior versus when the adult is making conscious choices informed by present circumstances. The patterns don't disappear, they become conscious. When the impulse to fawn arises, instead of automatically enacting it, there's recognition, This is the scared child who learned that accommodation equals safety. That recognition itself is healing because it means the adult self is present and aware, capable of responding differently if circumstances warranted. The inner child gets to remain part of the internal system without running the whole system. Their fears are acknowledged as historically legitimate, without being treated as accurate assessments of current reality. And the adult self gradually becomes a reliable internal caregiver, not in the sense of indulging every impulse or avoiding all discomfort, but in the sense of being present, attuned, and responsive to actual needs, in ways that support genuine well-being rather than just repeating familiar protective patterns that no longer protect. The person who couldn't set boundaries at work and was operating from the hypervigilant 6-year-old survival strategy has options once recognition occurs. They can notice the automatic yes forming and pause. They can feel the fear that saying no triggers. They can recognize that fear as belonging to the child who experienced parental withdrawal as existentially threatening. They can acknowledge to that child part that the danger was real.
And they can remind both the child and themselves that the current boss isn't the volatile parent, that adult employment doesn't carry the same life or death stakes as childhood attachment, and that boundaries might risk disapproval but won't result in abandonment or harm. From that integrated awareness, an actual choice about the work request becomes possible, a choice informed by adult assessment of capacity, priorities, and consequences, rather than by childhood panic about what refusal might cost. That's not healing as dramatic transformation or permanent cure. That's healing as growing capacity to recognize patterns, interrupt automatic reactions, and choose responses that serve present well-being even when childhood programming insists different behavior is necessary for survival. The inner child doesn't disappear. They just don't have to run everything anymore. And that shift, incremental and undramatic as it might seem, changes everything about how life feels and what becomes possible.